The Halcyon Conservatory for Interstellar Studies occupied a space station so meticulously comfortable, so obsessively engineered for the well-being of its occupants, that it made the galaxy's finest resorts look like emergency shelters by comparison, floating in a stable orbit around a mild, agreeable yellow star in the Thren expanse. It represented, by every metric the Galactic Education Board had ever bothered to measure, the pinnacle of civilized learning. Here, the sons and daughters of ambassadors, corporate directors, and the occasional minor planetary royal learned to navigate the delicate social and political currents of a galaxy that had, after a great deal of difficulty, finally figured out how to stop destroying itself every few centuries. The conservatory accepted students from 51 different sapient species, each one carefully vetted, thoroughly vaccinated, and meticulously documented before ever setting foot aboard the station. Its atmospheric processors could cycle between 14 distinct breathing mixtures. Its gravity generators offered settings ranging from a gentle 0.3 standard up to a still quite generous 0.85, because anything heavier was considered, by galactic consensus, faintly barbaric. Its food synthesizers could produce more than 19,000 distinct meal combinations, every single one carefully balanced against a database of known allergies, religious dietary law, and at least one species' deeply held philosophical objection to consuming anything with a symmetrical molecular structure. It was, in every meaningful sense, a monument to civilization's long, careful triumph over the chaotic, violent universe that had preceded it. The student body reflected that triumph faithfully. There were the Threndi, graceful, six-limbed beings who communicated much of their emotional nuance through slow, rippling shifts in the color of their skin, and who considered any raised voice a sign of significant psychological distress requiring immediate counseling. There were the Vethrin, drifting, translucent, jellyfish-like beings who required water-filled mobility pods to move through the conservatory's corridors, and whose educational traditions stretched back some 11,000 uninterrupted years. There were the Corvesi twins, covered head to foot in soft, downy feathers and possessed of 3 calm, wide-set eyes apiece, hailing from a species that had formally abolished violence as a matter of law and custom nearly a millennium earlier, and now spent the considerable balance of its cultural energy composing poetry and cultivating an enormous, well-documented variety of ceremonial teas. In short, these were the children of prey species who had, against long odds and ancient predators, won. They had climbed to the very top of their respective worlds through intelligence, cooperation, and perhaps most crucially of all, by having evolved somewhere reasonably far from anything that had ever seriously wanted to eat them. And then humanity had gone and discovered faster-than-light travel. The galactic community had greeted Earth's arrival with an enthusiasm typically reserved for learning that a distant, unfamiliar relative has just been released from a long prison sentence and would like to move onto your couch indefinitely. The humans themselves seemed pleasant enough, certainly, with their easy diplomatic smiles and their almost suspicious eagerness to trade. But there was something in their species file that made administrators across a dozen sectors develop sudden, unexplained headaches. Planet of origin, Earth. Classification, Death World Class 9. That single number alone was usually enough to end a promising bureaucratic career in a hurry. Class 9 meant that roughly 90% of the galaxy's known sapient species would die on Earth's surface within a single standard week, from the gravity, the weather, the microbial load, or most alarmingly of all, from the sheer variety of other things that lived there, and had spent unfathomable stretches of evolutionary time getting extremely good at killing one another. Earth had animals, plural, capable of killing a fully grown human. Earth had plants capable of doing the same. Earth had weather patterns capable of the same, on a schedule that appeared to outside observers to be entirely at random. Earth's humans, in short, appeared to have spent the whole of their evolutionary history locked in a running arms race against nearly everything around them, and had won that race by developing a bizarre, unsettling combination of endurance, adaptability, and what their own psychological profiles delicately termed a notably relaxed attitude toward personal risk. But the galactic community prided itself, above almost everything else, on inclusivity, and humans had, on paper, technically satisfied every formal requirement for admission. They possessed working faster-than-light drives. They maintained a semi-functional global gov. Earning body, and they had remarkably gone a full 17 years without deploying a single nuclear weapon against one another, practically a diplomatic miracle for a species so newly arrived among the stars. So when the human government formally requested that its citizens be permitted to attend educational institutions throughout coalition space, the galactic community had agreed with reservations. Many, many reservations. An almost unprecedented volume of liability waivers. The human girl arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was, by galactic statistical consensus, the single most unremarkable day of the standard interstellar week, and therefore seemed appropriately low-key for what several administrators privately suspected might turn out to be a fairly volatile event. She walked through the docking bay towing a battered rolling suitcase that had clearly survived several long journeys already, wearing what her registration documents identified as a school uniform from her home region, a plain white blouse, a pleated navy skirt, knee socks, and a blazer that bore the faint, honest wear of at least one minor laundering disaster. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple braid. She carried no visible weapon, no armor, no protective gear of any kind. She looked, by the unanimous private assessment of every alien who happened to see her cross the bay, almost aggressively harmless. Director Sethrin Call, a distinguished veteran whose family had overseen coalition educational institutions across 3 generations, floated in his mobility pod near the arrivals gate to greet her personally, partly out of genuine institutional pride, and partly because the conservatory's insurance carrier had specifically, formally required that an executive-level administrator be physically present for the arrival of any Class 9 student. "Welcome to Halcyon Conservatory," he said, his translation collar rendering his words in smooth, unhurried coalition standard, his tentacles forming the traditional veteran gesture of peaceful greeting. "We are honored to welcome you into our student body. I trust your journey was a pleasant one." The girl smiled, and Director Call found himself trying very hard not to think about the fact that the baring of teeth was, on a solid majority of coalition worlds, a threat display rather than an expression of goodwill. "It was great, thank you so much," she said. "I'm so excited to be here. This place is unbelievable." She looked around the vast, gleaming docking bay with what appeared to be entirely genuine enthusiasm, her eyes, both of them, forward-facing, binocular, precisely the sort of predator's eyes evolution favored in something that once needed to track fast-moving prey, taking in every detail at once. "Excellent," Director Call said. "Your quarters have been prepared in Dormitory 7, Section Blue. We've adjusted the atmospheric mixture to Earth standard, and the gravity in your room has been set to 0.9 standard, which we hope you'll find comfortable." "Oh, that's really thoughtful, but you really didn't have to go to the trouble. I can adapt to whatever setting the rest of the station usually runs. Director Call's tentacles twitched in a way that, to any other veteran observer, would have registered unmistakably as suppressed alarm. Of course she could adapt. Of course she could. She had evolved on a planet where the failure to adapt quickly enough was, quite literally, a fatal design flaw. Nevertheless, he said smoothly, we want you to feel at home. Your first class begins in approximately 1 standard hour. Your schedule has already been uploaded to your personal device. Do you have any questions before you settle in? The girl adjusted the strap of her backpack. A curious habit, Call noted, carrying one's belongings strapped directly to the body rather than in some more dignified transport apparatus, and smiled again. Just one. Where's the cafeteria? I'm starving. She said it with such easy, casual cheer that it took Director Call a full second to process the specific word she'd used. He'd studied for this. Humans, according to the extensive briefing packet his office had prepared, routinely used the word starving to describe the ordinary, entirely survivable sensation of moderate hunger, rather than any genuine, acute risk of caloric death. It was one of dozens of small linguistic quirks that hinted, in their briefing material's own careful phrasing, at a species with a markedly different historical relationship to food scarcity than the coalition norm. The main dining hall is on Deck 5, he said. Our synthesizers have been programmed with a range of human-compatible options. Awesome, thank you so much, Director. I really appreciate all of this. She walked off with a light, springing step, her suitcase's small wheels squeaking softly against the polished deck plating. Director Call watched her go and found himself unable entirely to shake the distinct impression that he had just personally welcomed a very friendly, very cheerful predator into a carefully, painstakingly cultivated garden. He added a brief note to his private log before proceeding to his next appointment. Day 1, Hour 0. Human student appears sociable, well-adjusted, and entirely at ease. This is, if anything, more concerning than if she had arrived carrying visible weaponry. The girl's name, according to the registration files Director Call had reviewed at some length the previous evening, was Sadie Okonkwo, 17 standard years of age, originally from a coastal settlement in what her file listed simply as the West African region, her application expressing, among other things, an ambition to eventually specialize in either xenobiology or interspecies diplomatic engineering, and in a detail Call found himself returning to more than once that evening. A stated hope of one day joining the conservatory's celebrated interspecies debate team, a program her application described with evident sincerity as the thing I'm most excited about, honestly, even more than the classes. Her first class of the morning was Introduction to Xenobiology, taught by a veteran Threndi instructor named Professor Illith, whose 17 years at the conservatory and 2 published cross-species physiology texts had earned him a reputation as one of the school's most respected, if occasionally excitable, faculty members. The classroom was arranged in a wide circular pattern, its cushioned seating designed to comfortably accommodate a broad range of body types, its lighting soft and warm. A faint, deliberately calming floral scent pumped gently through the ventilation system to promote focus and reduce ambient anxiety. Professor Illith had spent the previous evening reviewing everything the conservatory's archives held on Earth biology, and now possessed a great deal of information he sincerely wished he did not. Sadie chose a seat near the middle of the circular room, settling in beside a visibly nervous Corvesi student named Fennec and directly across from a veteran student named Murrin, whose mobility pod bobbed gently in its designated berth. She set down her bag, produced an actual physical notebook, pressed plant fiber. Remarkably, an artifact Illith found himself regarding with a strange anthropological fascination, along with a simple writing implement, and looked up at the front of the room with an expression of open, eager attentiveness. "Good morning, everyone," Illith began, his chromataphors rippling through a slow, deliberately calming blue as he addressed the class. "Today we begin our survey of sapient diversity across the Coalition's member worlds. We'll examine how differing environmental pressures have shaped not only the bodies of various species, but their minds, their societies, and their cultures as well." He activated the classroom's central holographic display. A gentle, sun-dappled image of a lush, temperate world bloomed to life above the seating circle. "This is Threnville, my own homeworld. As you can see, it's classified a Class 2 world minimal environmental hazard, a stable, forgiving climate, abundant natural resources. My species evolved in an environment where cooperation and clear communication offered the greatest survival advantage. We developed a complex color-based language, elaborate social structures, and learned early to cultivate our food rather than pursue it." The display shifted, showing an endless, gently rolling expanse of pale, tranquil ocean. The Vethrin homeworld follows a similar pattern. Their primary evolutionary pressure was never predation or scarcity, but rather the need to navigate a vast, three-dimensional environment and preserve accumulated cultural knowledge reliably across many, many generations. The students took notes dutifully, nodding along at material most of them had encountered, in one form or another, throughout their entire academic careers. The familiar, gently self-congratulatory account of civilized evolution that reinforced, quietly and repeatedly, just how far each of their own species had come from the chaos of the wider universe. Illith hesitated, his chromataphors flickering briefly toward an anxious yellow. "And then," he said, "we have worlds like Earth." He changed the display, and the classroom filled almost instantly with a chorus of soft gasps and one small, involuntary yelp of alarm. The hologram now showed Earth in its full, unfiltered severity, vast storm systems churning across restless oceans, tectonic plates grinding audibly against one another, weather patterns capable of shifting from mild to lethal within a matter of hours. The image zoomed slowly across a series of landscapes, dense, humid jungles where every visible organism appeared to be either actively hunting or actively fleeing something else. Arid deserts capable of cooking an unprotected body by day and freezing it solid by night. And most unsettlingly of all, a brief, carefully curated survey of Earth's megafauna. "Earth is formally classified a Class 9 death world," Illith continued, his voice carefully controlled. "It has produced literally thousands of species that would be considered, by any coalition standard, absolutely terrifying. Surface gravity runs at roughly 1.4 times Threnville standard. Atmospheric oxygen content is high enough to induce measurable oxidative stress in most non-native physiologies. The planet remains geologically hyperactive, with frequent, unpredictable seismic and volcanic activity. And its biodiversity includes a truly staggering number of organisms that evolved specifically, deliberately, to kill and consume other organisms." He pulled up a close, detailed image of something the display labeled simply saltwater crocodile. Several students made small, distressed noises. "And humans," Illith said, his voice taking on an almost reverent note of dread. evolved not as this world's dominant apex predator, but as something in certain respects considerably stranger. They are persistence hunters. Their primary evolutionary advantage was the simple, terrible ability to keep moving long after their prey had physically collapsed from exhaustion. They regulate core temperature through an evaporative secretion system that allows them to remain fully functional across a temperature range that would prove immediately fatal to most of us. They possess a regenerative capacity that permits recovery from injuries that would permanently disable almost any other sapient species. And perhaps most disturbingly of all, their physiological stress response does not typically produce freezing or flight. It produces increased strength, increased speed, and heightened focus. Sadie had been listening to all of this with a slightly puzzled expression, her writing implement hovering, motionless, above her open notebook. Now she raised one hand. Professor Illith's chromataphors went, in an instant, entirely white with alarm. "Yes, I'm sorry, Professor, but I think there might be some kind of translation error somewhere. We're really not that scary. I mean, yes, Earth's got some dangerous animals, but mostly we just stay away from them. Or, we built cities and stuff so we don't really have to deal with them day to day." The entire class turned as one to stare at her. "You built cities," Fennec said slowly, his soft feathers ruffling with visible agitation, "to hide from the things that wanted to eat you. I mean, that's kind of a simplified way of putting it, but sure, basically. And it's not like every single thing out there actually wants to eat us. Most wild animals are honestly more scared of humans than we are of them." "Because you are an apex predator," squeaked a small voice from near the back of the room. "I guess technically, but mostly I just eat sandwiches and instant noodles, so." Illith decided, with the swift, practiced instinct of a man who had learned when a lesson was no longer salvageable, that this was an excellent moment to move on. "Yes. Well, thank you very much for that valuable perspective. Now let's turn our attention to the broader concept of evolutionary niches and how." But he had already lost the room entirely. Every student was now staring at Sadie with an expression that hovered somewhere between fascination and outright terror, as though she were an unexploded ordnance that might, at any moment, and with no particular warning, go off. She seemed, for her own part, entirely oblivious to any of it, taking careful notes with a small, focused frown of concentration, occasionally tucking a loose strand of hair behind one ear in a gesture that was surely meant to be entirely innocuous, and that somehow, in that particular room, looked faintly, unaccountably threatening regardless. The class ended with Professor Illith feeling as though he had personally aged several standard years across the course of a single 50-minute period. He made a private note to contact the conservatory's counseling office before the day was out. His students were very likely going to need it. He suspected, with a certain weary honesty, that he might need it himself. Physical education followed immediately after, and if xenobiology had proven merely concerning, physical education was about to become the stuff of dormitory legend for years afterward. The conservatory's gymnasium was itself a marvel of adaptive coalition engineering, capable of adjusting gravity, atmosphere, and even certain fundamental structural properties of the playing surface to suit whichever combination of species happened to be scheduled for a given period. Today's instructor was Coach Farron, a Corvessy veteran who had once competed at the Coalition Games before retiring into a long, well-regarded teaching career, and who believed firmly, sincerely, in the developmental importance of regular physical activity, though her personal definition of appropriately vigorous activity ran, by any human standard, extremely generously mild. The day's scheduled activity was a sport called driftball, involving the gentle propulsion of a large, soft, inflated sphere toward marked goal zones within a deliberately low-gravity environment. Today's gravity was set to a floating 0.4 standard, permitting long, dramatic, slow-motion leaps and extended airtime. Considered by galactic athletic consensus, quite an impressively demanding sport in its own right. Sadie arrived in what she called gym clothes. Simple, soft, athletic pants and a plain shirt bearing some faded logo, and looked around the gymnasium with open interest, bouncing lightly on the balls of her feet in a way that caused several nearby students to instinctively take a small, cautious step backward. "All right, everyone," Coach Farron chirped, her feathers fluffed with characteristic enthusiasm. "Today we're focusing on teamwork and spatial coordination. I'll divide you into 2 squads and we'll play a friendly match. Remember, the point isn't winning. The point is building trust and coordination with your teammates." It was, by any measure, an extremely civilized approach to organized athletics. No one kept an official score. No one pushed too hard against another player's comfort threshold. The emphasis, always, rested firmly on cooperation rather than competition. Sadie was assigned to the blue squad alongside Fennec, Murrin, and a pair of Threndy students. They gathered at their starting position, and Coach Farron ran quickly through the rules. Move the sphere toward your designated goal, avoid excessive physical contact, remain considerate of everyone's individual physical limitations at all times. The whistle sounded, and the match began. For the first several minutes, everything proceeded exactly as expected. Students drifted gently through the low gravity, softly nudging the sphere back and forth between one another, occasionally colliding lightly and apologizing with genuine, careful sincerity. It was all extremely dignified and extremely calm. Then Sadie jumped. In 0.4 standard gravity, after a lifetime spent at 1.4, jumping became something else entirely. She launched herself clean across the gymnasium in a long, sweeping parabolic arc that would have looked entirely at home in a martial arts film, intercepted the sphere cleanly at the apex of its own slow arc, tucked it neatly against her chest, and landed in a low, controlled crouch that should, by every reasonable expectation, have shattered both her knees on impact, but instead simply flexed smoothly, absorbing the force as though it were nothing at all. The entire gymnasium fell instantly, completely silent, save for the soft bounce of the sphere as she set it carefully down, looking around at the sudden, stunned stillness with visible confusion. "Was that not okay? Sorry, I can tone it down if I need to." Coach Farron's beak had fallen fully open. "How did your legs, that should have?" "Oh, the gravity in here's really comfortable, honestly. This is actually super fun. It's kind of like being on the moon, except, with breathable air." "You've been to your moon?" Fennec asked, his voice faint. "Not me personally, no, but plenty of humans have way back. We put a flag up there and everything. It's kind of a whole historical thing back home." The match resumed, though every other student on the court remained now acutely, uncomfortably aware that they were sharing a playing field with someone capable of crossing its entire length in a single bound. Someone who moved with a speed and precision that seemed genuinely impossible for something built so softly, so apparently fragile. Sadie was clearly, visibly trying to hold herself back, to play gently within everyone else's comfort range. But even her deliberately restrained movements carried an unmistakable, controlled power that felt utterly alien to the rest of the court. At one point, Murren's mobility pod drifted slightly off course, bumping unexpectedly against her. Sadie caught it one-handed, steadying it smoothly before it could tumble. "You okay?" she asked cheerfully. Murren made a sound very much like water draining rapidly down a narrow pipe, and simply bobbed silently in place for several seconds, entirely unable to form a coherent word. By the time the match ended, Sadie had scored 6 goals, blocked 12 attempted shots, and inadvertently demonstrated that her species' idea of a relaxed, casual effort would qualify, on most coalition worlds, as a record-setting athletic performance. She jogged lightly off the court, barely breathing hard, while several of her teammates lay collapsed in various states of exhausted disbelief around the gymnasium floor. Coach Farron added a brief note to her own teaching log that evening. Human student displays physical capability far in excess of standard developmental parameters. Recommend either dedicated separate PE track or possibly a discrete restraining protocol. Strongly recommend additional counseling resources for remainder of class. Lunch was meant to be a calm, unremarkable social affair. The conservatory's central dining hall had been designed specifically as a space for genuine cultural exchange, where students from a dozen different worlds could share meals and conversation in a comfortable, low-pressure atmosphere. Its synthesizers carried thousands of carefully balanced recipes, each one screened rigorously for nutrition and safety. Sadie moved through the serving line with visible interest, examining her options with open curiosity before selecting something resembling pasta, a colorful vegetable dish, a piece of fruit that gave off a faint, gentle glow, and a beverage that fizzed with slow, effervescent bubbles. She found a table where Fennec and Murren were already seated, gave them a friendly wave, and asked politely whether she might join them. Both were, by their own species, deeply ingrained social conditioning, entirely too polite to say no, though they exchanged a brief, unmistakable glance that communicated a great deal of shared, private concern. "So," Sadie said, twirling her pasta with practiced ease, "what do you guys think of the school so far?" "It is very prestigious," Fennec managed, nibbling carefully at some kind of seed mixture. "My family has sent scholars here across 3 generations." "That's so cool. What are you studying?" "Diplomatic relations, with a focus on interspecies trade agreements." "Nice. I'm probably going to end up in xenobiology or maybe engineering. Haven't totally decided yet." Murren's mobility pod tilted slightly, a gesture that might, in a veteran more comfortable expressing outright curiosity, have registered as genuine interest overcoming caution. "You remain interested in xenobiology even after this morning's class." "Oh, especially after this morning's class, honestly. I had no idea humans were considered that unusual. I mean, I knew Earth was classified a death world, but I figured that was just kind of relative to really safe planets. I didn't realize we were actually, like, scary." "You are not scary," Fennec said quickly, politely, and not remotely convincingly. "You are simply very capable," Murren added, "in a manner that is somewhat alarming to those of us who evolved in considerably more forgiving environments." Sadie laughed, and both of her table mates flinched visibly at the sound. "That's such a nice, diplomatic way to put it. You're really good at this. I can see why you're in that program." She took a bite of her pasta, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed. "This is actually really good, by the way. What do you two think of the food here?" "It is adequate," Fennec said carefully. "The synthesizers are quite sophisticated," Murren added. "They accommodate most known dietary requirements." "That's so convenient." Back home, we'd have to actually cook things or order takeout. Having a machine that just makes whatever you want on demand feels like the future, honestly. There was a brief, quiet pause while both of her table mates privately processed the concept of needing to manually prepare food from raw ingredients on a regular basis, a notion that struck them both as simultaneously primitive and somehow deeply exhausting. "Can I ask you something?" Fennec said a little hesitantly. "Sure, go for it." "Is it true that Earth has plants capable of killing a person?" "Oh yeah, tons of them. There's one called hemlock that's super poisonous. There's poison ivy, which won't actually kill you but makes your skin react really badly. Some mushrooms will absolutely wreck your liver if you eat the wrong one. And people simply live among these things. Well, we learn which ones to avoid, mostly. It's not like they jump out and attack you or anything. Mostly." She paused, considering. "There's this one plant in a specific region back home with these tiny needles covered in toxin, and if you brush against it, you're in serious pain for months afterward. But that particular region is kind of a special case. Pretty much everything there is trying to kill you one way or another." Both aliens stared at her. "And people still choose to live there?" Murrin asked, in a voice that had gone slightly strangled. "Oh, millions of people, yeah. It's actually really nice if you're careful. Great beaches." She took another bite of pasta, entirely oblivious to the quiet existential unease she was steadily generating across the table. "What about your homeworlds? Any dangerous plants or animals where you're from?" "The most dangerous organism on my homeworld," Fennec said faintly, "is a small bird known to occasionally steal food from outdoor market stalls." "On the Vethrin homeworld," Murrin added, "there was once a species of algae capable of causing minor digestive discomfort if consumed in large quantities. It was formerly Elimina. Ted, as a matter of public safety, approximately 4,000 years ago." "Wow, your worlds sound really peaceful. That must be so nice." Both of them realized, in the same quiet moment, that Sadie genuinely meant this as a sincere compliment, that she looked at their safe, predictable, thoroughly domesticated worlds with something close to open envy, and that she had, apparently, absolutely no working concept of exactly how unsettling her own casual, everyday relationship with lethal risk actually appeared from the outside. Lunch continued for some while longer, generating a steady, mounting series of increasingly alarming revelations about Earth. That humans had, at some point in their history, domesticated wolves into affectionate household companions. That they regularly, voluntarily consumed capsaicin purely for enjoyment, despite it being, in origin, a plant's chemical defense mechanism. And that a significant portion of their recreational culture involved something called horror entertainment, in which humans deliberately, recreationally frightened themselves for fun. By the meal's end, Fennec and Murrin had formed what could only be described as a tentative friendship built on shared, quiet trauma, while Sadie had made, in her own estimation, two genuinely lovely new friends, blissfully unaware that both of them were already, privately, planning to keep their dormitory doors locked that evening. Chemistry that afternoon was when matters truly, memorably escalated. Professor Dorlan, a meticulous Threndi instructor, took laboratory safety with an almost religious seriousness. His classroom was outfitted with the most current containment fields, fire suppression systems, and emergency evacuation routing available anywhere on the station. He opened every single session with a mandatory 15-minute safety briefing covering proper equipment handling, correct disposal procedure, and the non-negotiable importance of protective gear at all times. Sadie listened attentively throughout, her safety goggles properly seated, her lab coat correctly buttoned. She'd been paired for the day's exercise with a veteran student named Coral and one of the Corvesi twins, Sorrel. Today's assignment involved combining several stable, well-understood compounds to observe a straightforward color-changing reaction, designed from the ground up to be entirely safe, requiring only the most basic precautions and producing results that were visually pleasant and chemically inert in every practical sense. Professor Dorland made his usual careful rounds, checking each station's progress, offering the occasional gentle correction. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan. And then Sorrel knocked over a beaker. It was a simple accident, the ordinary, unremarkable sort that happens in laboratories everywhere on every world. The beaker tipped, rolled, and slid off the edge of the workstation. It contained a mild alkaline solution that would, under ordinary circumstances, have created a minor mess requiring perhaps 5 minutes of cleanup. But it was falling, this particular time, directly toward a heating element another lab group had accidentally left switched on, beside which sat an open container of solvent that, while harmless enough on its own, became sharply, unpredictably reactive when rapidly heated in the presence of an alkaline compound. Professor Dorland watched the entire sequence unfold in the strange, elongated slow motion of genuine crisis, his chromatophores flaring through a rapid cascade of alarm colors as he opened his mouth to shout a warning he already knew, with grim certainty, would arrive too late calculating, even as he moved, exactly how bad the resulting reaction was likely to be. Not catastrophic, probably, but considerable heat, considerable smoke, quite possibly enough to trigger the room's automated fire suppression systems, and certainly enough to end the class period several hours ahead of schedule. The beaker fell, and Sadie moved. She didn't think about it, didn't pause to weigh alternatives or calculate risk in any conscious, deliberate way. Her hand simply shot out, closing around the falling beaker approximately 3 centimeters above the heating element's exposed coil, her reflexes operating at a speed that made the whole sequence look, to every other witness in the room, like a well-rehearsed magic trick. She straightened up, holding the beaker carefully upright, and looked toward Professor Dorland with a faintly sheepish expression. "Sorry, is this yours? I think it fell." The entire classroom froze. 18 students and 1 instructor stared at her, their expressions ranging across the full spectrum from shock to open awe to something bordering on genuine dread. "You caught it," Professor Dorland said, his voice noticeably weak. "Yeah, it was about to spill. That would have made a mess." She paused, registering the sheer stillness of the room around her. "You moved so fast." "Did I? Sorry, I didn't mean to startle anyone. I just saw it start to fall, and my hand kind of went automatically." Professor Dorland's mind was already racing forward through the implications. Human reaction time, apparently, ran considerably faster than even the conservatory's own briefing materials had suggested. Their spatial tracking appeared exceptional. And most unsettling of all, they possessed what could only honestly be described as genuine predator reflexes. The specific, lightning-fast responses evolution reserves almost exclusively for organisms that once needed to intercept fast-moving prey. "That was incredible," Coral said, her tentacles waving with unmistakable, genuine admiration. "I didn't even register it falling." "Oh, thanks. I play a fair amount of sport back home, so I guess I've gotten pretty good at tracking things in motion." Sport on a Class 9 death world, involving the tracking of fast-moving objects, using reflexes evolved in origin for the pursuit and interception of prey. Professor Dorland decided, with the swift, practiced instinct that had served him well across a long teaching career, that this was an excellent moment for an early break. "Class," he announced, his voice not entirely steady, "why don't we take 10 minutes, get some air, hydrate, perhaps quietly reconsider a few of your fundamental assumptions about the universe?" The students fled the laboratory as though it had genuinely caught fire, leaving Sadie standing alone in the middle of the room, still holding the beaker, looking thoroughly confused. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. "No," Professor Dorland said, silently wondering whether his personal medical coverage extended to stress-induced chromataph or failure. "No, you did everything exactly right. That is, unfortunately, the entire problem." History and galactic civilization occupied the final period of the day, taught by an elderly, mildly eccentric veteran instructor named Professor Vantrell, whose reputation across the conservatory rested equally on his considerable intellect and his fondness for long, meandering philosophical digressions. His classroom followed a traditional arrangement, students seated in a wide semicircle around his mobility pod, the surrounding walls covered in slowly rotating holographic panels depicting various moments from galactic history. Today's lecture concerned the broad evolution of galactic civilization, and more specifically, the ancient, foundational distinction between predator and prey species. "The fundamental divide in galactic civilization," Vantrell began, his tentacles gesturing with slow, deliberate emphasis, "is not, as many young scholars initially assume, a matter of differing technology or differing systems of governance. It is, at its deepest root, the divide between species whose evolutionary history was shaped by being hunted, and species whose evolutionary history was shaped by hunting." He brought up a chart, various coalition species arranged along a broad spectrum. At one end, we find the pure prey species, the Vethrin, the Corvesi, several others among us. We evolved under sustained pressure from active predation, which selected strongly for intelligence, cooperation, and above all, a healthy, well-developed aversion to unnecessary risk. We built our civilizations on principles of safety, careful consensus, and patient, methodical planning. The display shifted, showing a different cluster of species, marked by sharper features, forward-set eyes. At the opposite end, we find species with genuinely predatory evolutionary backgrounds. They remain comparatively rare across galactic civilization, because the very psychological traits that make an organism an effective hunter, aggression, risk tolerance, competitiveness, frequently make it considerably harder for that same organism to develop the kind of patient, cooperative civilization our coalition depends upon. A few species have managed it regardless, and they tend, historically, to dominate fields like military service or extreme frontier survey work. A student near the front raised a manipulator limb. "Professor, where do humans fall on the spectrum?" Vantrell's tentacles performed a slow, rippling gesture that translated roughly to a shrug. "An excellent question, with a genuinely unsettling answer. Humans are formally classified as persistence hunters with strongly omnivorous adaptations, and somewhat counterintuitively, remarkably sophisticated social structures." He brought up a new image, Earth rotating slowly above the assembled students. "They evolved as prey animals who became predators through nothing more sophisticated than sheer, relentless stubbornness. Unable to outrun the creatures that hunted them, they simply kept following those same creatures, patiently, indefinitely, until their prey finally collapsed from pure exhaustion. In the process, they developed complex, layered communication, not merely for basic operation, but for coordinating extended, multi-day hunts across considerable distances. Their social structures rest heavily on group loyalty, layered hierarchy, and most fascinatingly of all, a documented, evolved capacity to extend genuine trust and cooperation even to complete strangers. Sadie had been listening quietly throughout, but now raised her hand. Every head in the room turned to look at her. Vantral's tentacles curled with obvious, delighted interest. Please, enlighten us. You possess a perspective the rest of this room entirely lacks. She stood, smoothing down her skirt in a small, faintly nervous gesture. It's just, yes, humans did hunt historically. And yes, our ancestors dealt with a lot of genuine danger. But we're not like walking around every day thinking about hunting and killing things. Most of us have never actually hunted anything in our whole lives. We go to school. We have hobbies. We hang out with our friends. We worry about exams and relationships and whether we remembered to finish our homework. We're just regular people trying to get through an ordinary day, mostly. But you come from a Class 9 death world, Fennec pointed out from across the room. Right, but that's just where we're from. It doesn't define everything about who we actually are. Your reflexes are measurably, significantly faster than ours, Professor Vantral said gently. I guess that's just normal for us. You can survive gravity that would crush most species, because that's just Earth's gravity and we're built for it. You can safely consume things that would be toxic to most other biologies, because our physiology developed resistance to certain compounds a long time ago. It's not like we're actively trying to be scary about any of it. Vantral's tentacles waved in the particular sweeping pattern that indicated genuine academic delight. But don't you see, that is precisely what makes your species so fascinating. You possess every trait that would make you exceptional, formidable predators. And yet you have built, over time, a civilization that prizes cooperation, creativity, and peace above nearly everything else. You are a species of warriors who, given the choice, mostly seem to want to write poetry and explore the stars. Sadie sat back down slowly, looking genuinely troubled. We're really not warriors, though. We just evolved to survive a difficult environment. Every species evolved to survive, Vantral said softly. But your species survived something that would have swiftly ended most others. And then, having survived it, you looked up at the stars and decided you wanted to become neighbors with beings who are, by your own standards, almost inconceivably fragile. That takes a rather particular kind of courage, or perhaps simply a rather particular kind of optimism. A long, thoughtful silence settled across the room. So what you're saying, Murrin ventured hesitantly, is that humans are predators who have chosen deliberately not to be. I am saying, Vantral replied, that humans, like all sapient beings, are complicated. Neither purely predator nor purely prey, but something genuinely in between. And perhaps that is precisely why they unsettle us so. We are accustomed to clear categories, clear roles. Humans do not fit neatly into either of our boxes. Sadie was looking down at her own hands, her expression thoughtful. I never really thought about it quite like that before. Back home, I'm just a normal student. Here, apparently, I'm this weird, scary thing, and I genuinely have no idea how to make everyone feel more comfortable around me. Start simply by being yourself, Vantral suggested. Give us time to adjust. We are, whatever our evolutionary caution, intellectually curious creatures at heart. Once prey species move past our initial fear, we tend, more often than not, to become genuinely fascinated instead. The class ended on that note, students filing out more thoughtfully than usual, casting glances back at Sadie that carried. For the first time that day, something perceptibly less like fear and something perceptibly more like curiosity. The emergency arrived 3 days later, just as the conservatory's student body was beginning, cautiously, to settle into an uneasy but functional routine around its newest, most alarming arrival. Sadie had learned, over those 3 days, to move a little more slowly through crowded corridors, to laugh a little more quietly so as not to startle anyone unnecessarily. Her classmates, for their part, had begun to learn that she wasn't going to suddenly, inexplicably attack anyone, that she was in fact remarkably friendly, and that her idea of a genuinely frightening story tended to involve camping trips and half-remembered movie plots rather than anything resembling actual violence. It was, by the standards of the preceding 3 days, almost peaceful. And then the debris strike hit. It wasn't a large fragment, simply a small piece of uncharted space debris that had somehow slipped past the station's outer detection grid and impact shielding. It punched cleanly through the outer hull in a section of Dormitory 7, triggering immediate decompression across 3 adjoining rooms and setting off every alarm system the station possessed. Emergency bulkheads slammed down in rapid, staggered sequence, sealing the dormitory into isolated sections. Automated safety systems engaged, oxygen masks deployed from ceiling panels, and a calm, synthetic voice began issuing standard evacuation instructions to a corridor full of students who were, by and large, entirely too frightened to process any of it clearly. Sadie had been in the dormitory's common study area when the impact occurred. She felt the shudder run through the station's structure, heard the alarms begin their rising wail, saw the emergency lighting flicker on around her in urgent, pulsing red. Students were scattering, some frozen entirely in place, others running in directions that made no particular sense, none of them entirely certain what came next despite a semester's worth of safety drills. Something in Sadie's mind, shaped across a very long evolutionary history of genuinely life-threatening situations, simply clicked without any conscious deliberation at all, directly into crisis mode. "Everyone stay calm," she called out, and her voice cut cleanly through the surrounding chaos with an authority that made every nearby student stop mid-motion to look at her. "Is anyone hurt?" A scattering of head shakes, a few soft whimpers, but no immediate, visible injuries. "Okay, we need to get to the evacuation stations. They're marked with the blue lights. We're moving together as a group. Stay behind me, watch your footing, and if you see anyone who needs help, call it out immediately." She started moving toward the nearest evacuation point, and without quite understanding why, the surrounding students simply fell in behind her. There was something in her bearing, in the flat, steady certainty of her voice, that inspired immediate, unquestioning obedience. This was a human, fully in her element, confronting a merely dangerous situation, and every instinct her body carried knew, with total clarity, exactly what needed to happen next. They reached the first evacuation station only to find its door jammed, warped by the shockwave of the impact. The station's synthetic voice continued its calm, entirely unhelpful recommendation that all personnel proceed to the nearest evacuation point. Sadie examined the door for perhaps 3 full seconds, gripped the emergency release handle, planted her feet in a way that suggested a working, practical understanding of leverage, and pulled. Nothing happened. She adjusted her grip and pulled again harder. The door, engineered to withstand considerable force, fitted with redundant safety mechanisms, theoretically requiring specialized hydraulic tools to bypass under emergency conditions, gave a sharp, protesting shriek of tortured metal and slid open. "Okay, everyone through. Quick but careful, watch your step." She held the door, arms straining visibly with the effort of keeping it braced open. as 17 frightened students scrambled through, one after another, into the emergency shelter beyond. When the last of them had cleared the threshold, she followed, letting the heavy door slam shut behind her. Inside the shelter, the students huddled together while Sadie moved swiftly through the environmental controls. Oxygen levels nominal, pressure stable, communications online. She activated the shelter's intercom. "This is emergency shelter 7 Blue. We have 18 students accounted for, no injuries, requesting a status update." The response came moments later in Director Call's own voice, carrying an unmistakable, immediate note of relief. "Acknowledged 7 Blue. Remain in place. Emergency crews are already responding to the breach. You should be fully secure there for at least the next 6 standard hours. Well done getting everyone to safety." She turned back to face the huddled group, most of whom were now staring at her with expressions that had moved well past simple fear, into something closer to genuine, quiet awe. "Everyone doing okay? Anyone feeling dizzy, having any trouble breathing?" A chorus of soft, negative responses. "Good, we're safe here, and the director says emergency crews are already on it, so we just need to sit tight and wait it out." She offered a small, reassuring smile. "Hey, at least we're all in this together, right? Could have been a lot worse." "You opened that door with your hands," Fennec said, his voice faint. "The mechanism was jammed. Somebody had to force it open." "You held it while all of us went through first," Murrin added quietly. "Well, yeah, I was the last one out. Wasn't going to let it slam shut on anyone." "You saved us," Fennec said simply. Sadie looked for the first time El Day genuinely, visibly embarrassed. "I just helped everyone get to safety. The station's own systems did most of the actual work. Besides, we're all okay. That's really what matters here." But the students knew, with perfect clarity, exactly what they had just witnessed. They had watched a human respond to a genuine crisis with a speed and competence none of them could have matched, watched her assess the danger, organize an entire group, solve an immediate physical problem, and secure everyone's safety, all within the span of perhaps 2 full minutes. They had seen, up close and entirely unfiltered, precisely what a death world species looked like when raw survival instinct met genuine training. It was terrifying. It was, in equal and simultaneous measure, deeply impressive. And none of them were entirely certain in that moment how to hold both of those feelings at once. They remained in the shelter for nearly 4 full hours before the all-clear finally came through. Sadie spent much of that time telling them about Earth, about her family, about her hopes for the conservatory, about her long-standing ambition to join the debate team. She described human cities and human culture with such evident, easy affection that it grew steadily harder to remember she'd come from a planet most of them had, only days earlier, regarded as an unmitigated nightmare. She showed them photographs on her personal device, her family's home, her friends back on Earth, a small household animal called a cat that looked, to every alien eye present, disturbingly like a compact predator, and that apparently lived comfortably indoors and was, by broad human consensus, considered extremely cute. By the time the shelter's heavy door finally reopened, something in the room had genuinely, permanently shifted. The students who emerged were still a little wary around their human classmate, still faintly, reflexively nervous. But they had also, somewhere across those 4 long hours, begun to see her as something considerably more than a walking collection of concerning evolutionary traits. She was, simply, someone who had cared, immediately and without hesitation, about their safety. Someone who had stayed calm through a genuine crisis, who had shared her snacks during the long wait, and who had made a handful of genuinely terrible jokes purely to keep everyone's spirits up. Director Call's formal incident report was, by necessity, extensive. It included security footage of Sadie forcing open the jammed evacuation door, a feat the conservatory's engineering staff later confirmed should, by rights, have required specialized hydraulic equipment. It included individual testimony from all 17 students she had personally guided to safety. And it included a brief, dryly worded note observing that the conservatory's insurance carrier was very likely, in the very near future, going to have some pointed questions. It also included, prominently, a formal recommendation that the human student be commended for her actions, and a gentle suggestion that the conservatory as a whole might genuinely benefit from considering what it stood to learn from having a death world species among its student body. The aftermath of the emergency produced subtle, steady shifts across the conservatory's broader social landscape. Sadie was no longer simply the alarming, unpredictable predator in a school uniform. She was, now, the alarming, unpredictable predator who had personally saved her entire dormitory section during a genuine hull breach. She remained, in most practical respects, exactly as intimidating as before, still capable of feats that seemed to violate ordinary physical expectation. But that capability now arrived paired with a reassuring, load-bearing certainty. She was unmistakably on their side. Fennec began sitting with her at lunch as a matter of routine, gradually bringing along other curious classmates who had, until then, been too nervous to approach on their own. She answered their questions about Earth with patience and easy humor, steadily learning to phrase her answers in ways that were genuinely informative without being unnecessarily alarming. Yes, humans needed regular physical exercise or their bodies would gradually deteriorate. No, that wasn't because they were inherently, unusually muscular. It was simply because their bodies were built for sustained activity, and Earth's gravity demanded it as a baseline. Murrin joined her study group for xenobiology, discovering along the way a genuine, unforced fascination with how differing species evolved to fit their differing environments. She asked questions, Sadie noticed, that seemed constantly, earnestly oriented toward understanding and appreciating difference, rather than judging it. Even Professor Illith eventually admitted, in a private conversation with Director Call some weeks later, that having an authentic human perspective present in his classroom had added a dimension to his own teaching he genuinely hadn't anticipated. When discussing evolutionary pressure and its downstream effects, he now had a living, breathing example demonstrating how a genuinely hostile environment could produce not merely aggression, but intelligence, empathy, and an almost stubborn, generous optimism. Sadie herself seemed, over those following weeks, to visibly bloom within her new environment. The early, sharp-edged awkwardness of her first days steadily faded as she made real friends, as she gradually found her own comfortable place within the conservatory's broader social ecosystem. She joined the xenobiology club without hesitation. She tried out for, and made, the interspecies debate team, a fact she reported to her family back home with an enthusiasm that bordered on outright euphoria. She even eventually convinced Coach Farron to let her help design a more demanding, optional athletic track for students who genuinely wanted to push themselves harder than the standard curriculum allowed. There remained, of course, occasional moments of cultural friction. There was the time she casually suggested a horror movie night, and had to be gently, carefully informed that what most humans found thrillingly entertaining, most other coalition species found simply, straightforwardly traumatic. There was the time she brought in samples of properly spiced food from home and watched, in genuine confusion, as her classmates reacted as though she'd offered them something closer to poison. There was the time she mentioned, entirely offhandedly, that she enjoyed hiking, and three separate students immediately began quietly discussing whether this constituted a formal safety concern worth reporting. But these moments grew steadily less frequent over time, and when they did occur, they were increasingly met with laughter rather than fear. Sadie became known, across the conservatory's broader student body, for her particular contradictions, the person who could tear a jammed door clean off its mounting, but who also cried without any embarrassment at all during sad films, who possessed reflexes that read on paper like genuine predator biology, but who reliably helped carry other students' bags whenever they seemed to be struggling, who came, undeniably, from a planet most of the galaxy regarded as a waking nightmare, and who nonetheless seemed to radiate, almost constantly, a kind of stubborn, unshakable optimism. 3 months into the semester, Director Call received a formal communication from the Coalition Education Board, inquiring, in careful bureaucratic language, exactly how the Human Integration Initiative was proceeding. Were there incidents worth flagging? Ongoing concerns? Should the board reconsider its broader policy of admitting Death World students into civilian educational institutions? Call floated in his office for some time, tentacles drumming thoughtfully against the surface of his mobility pod, composing his response with considerable care. The human student has exceeded every expectation set for her, he wrote. While her capabilities are, without question, exceptional and occasionally alarming, she has demonstrated conclusively that humans can integrate successfully into galactic civilian society. She has formed genuine, positive relationships with students from multiple species, maintained excellent academic standing throughout, and displayed qualities of leadership and compassion that would be considered an asset in any sapient being, regardless of origin. He paused, weighing his next line carefully. I believe our initial concerns regarding humans were substantially based on incomplete information. Yes, they originate from a death world. Yes, they possess traits we have historically associated exclusively with predatory species. But they also possess something our prior briefing materials failed entirely to account for: the demonstrated capacity to choose compassion over raw capability, cooperation over unchecked competition, and friendship over fear. They are not defined solely by the world that produced them, but by what they consistently, freely choose to do with the potential that world instilled in them. He added one final, practical note before submitting the report. I would recommend, however, that any future human students receive a considerably more comprehensive orientation regarding what other coalition species generally consider hazardous recreational activity. Our current student genuinely had no idea that recreational rock climbing, contact athletics, or the voluntary consumption of capsaicin would be considered extreme behavior by galactic standards. Improved communication on both sides would likely prevent a number of entirely avoidable cardiac incidents among our faculty going forward. The semester wound steadily toward finals, carrying with it the usual accumulating stress and anticipation. Sadie studied late into the evenings alongside Fennec and Murrin, Th. E3 of them forming an unlikely but genuinely effective study group. She helped explain predator-prey dynamics from a working predator's own internal perspective, while they, in turn, helped her navigate the intricate, layered social structures her pre-species classmates had developed over many thousands of years of careful, deliberate civilization building. One evening, taking a break from a particularly dense review session, Fennec finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting with him since the very beginning of the term. "Can I ask you something personal?" Sadie looked up from her notes. "Sure, go for it." "Are you ever actually afraid? I mean, with everything you're capable of, everything you can apparently survive, do you ever genuinely feel fear?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Constantly, honestly," she admitted. "I was terrified my first day here. I get nervous before every exam. I worry about whether people actually like me. I worry about my family back home more than I probably let on. Coming from a death world doesn't mean we don't feel fear, Fennec. It just means we've learned to function anyway, even while we're feeling it." "That's what makes you brave," Murrin said softly. "Not that you're fearless, that you're afraid and you act regardless." Sadie smiled. "I think that's honestly what makes anyone brave, no matter what planet they happen to be from. You two came to class every day next to an actual death world predator, even though you were scared. That took real courage, too." "We were terrified," Fennec admitted. "Past tense." He gave a small, sheepish ruffle of his feathers. "Still kind of terrified, if I'm being fully honest, but we're also friends now, and that matters considerably more." "I'll take it," Sadie laughed. Finals week arrived with its usual characteristic tension. Sadie approached her exams with the same focused, unhurried intensity she brought to nearly everything, which was to say, she studied thoroughly and carefully, but entirely without the low-grade existential panic that seemed to grip most of her classmates in the days beforehand. It wasn't, she'd explained more than once, that she didn't genuinely care about her results. It was simply that her threat assessment instincts, calibrated across a very long evolutionary history of genuine life-or-death stakes, correctly, automatically identified an academic examination as not, in fact, actually dangerous. This was, by turns, both admirable and mildly, persistently irritating to everyone studying alongside her. She earned high marks in xenobiology, submitting a genuinely insightful essay on convergent evolution across differing gravity environments. Her physical education assessment consisted largely of her performing what her instructor privately considered record-setting feats, while barely raising her breathing rate, followed by a short written component covering basic exercise physiology. She passed her history examination solidly, and her chemistry practical went smoothly, though Professor Dorlin, by his own later admission, watched her the entire session with the close, wary attention of a man expecting, at any moment, a beaker to fall. The final day of the semester arrived carrying its familiar mixture of relief and gentle melancholy. Students packed their belongings, exchanged contact details, made loose plans to reconnect over the coming break. Sadie found Fennec and Murrin in the common area, both looking noticeably subdued. "Hey, you two doing okay?" "Just sad the term's over already," Fennec said. "It went by so quickly." "I know, right? But we'll be back next semester, and we can message each other the whole break." "Will you be returning to Earth?" Murrin asked. "Yeah, for a few weeks. I miss my family, honestly, and I miss Earth gravity more than I expected to. It's going to feel strange walking around without feeling like I might float off." "Will you tell them about us?" She grinned. "Are you kidding? I'm going to tell everyone about my friends from space. My little brother's going to be so jealous he can hardly stand it." They talked a while longer, trading plans and shared memories from the term, until other students drifted over one by one, and what had started as a small, quiet conversation gradually expanded into an impromptu gathering. Someone produced snacks. Someone else started up music. Before long, a good portion of the dormitory had crowded into the common area, celebrating the end of the term and the unlikely friendships it had produced. Sadie looked around at the assembled group, Threndy students arguing cheerfully over competing study techniques, Corvesi trading photographs from home, Vethrin practicing elaborate color-based jokes for one another's amusement, and felt a genuine, settling wave of contentment. She had been so nervous at the very start about fitting in, about being accepted, about simply being too different from everyone around her. Somehow, against most of her own private expectations, it had all worked out. That night, finishing her packing, she recorded a short video message home. "Hey everyone, just wanted to let you know my first semester was genuinely amazing. Made real friends, did well in my classes, and only caused a few minor incidents. Okay, there was a hull breach and an emergency evacuation, but everyone was totally fine, and apparently I'm some kind of hero now. It's a long story. Anyway, I'm coming home in a few days, and I cannot wait to see all of you. I've got so much to tell you about aliens and space school. And yes, Mom, I've been eating properly. And yes, Dad, I've kept up with my training even with the gravity here being so low. Honestly, I feel like I could jump over buildings at this point. See you all soon. Love you." She sent the message, finished packing, and lay back on her bed, staring up at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would say a temporary goodbye to Halcyon Conservatory, return to Earth, walk again under proper, familiar gravity, eat food that hadn't come from a synthesizer, sleep in her own childhood bed. But she would also, she already knew, spend a good portion of that break quietly counting down the days until she could return to this strange, glittering station full of aliens who had gone, in the span of a single semester, from being genuinely afraid of her to being, unmistakably, her friends. She had found something here she hadn't quite expected to find, a place where being different was, in the end, simply okay, where her death world origins were understood, even if they weren't always entirely relatable, where she could be, all at once and without contradiction, both the frightening predator from the nightmare planet and the girl who cried during sad films. She fell asleep smiling, already looking forward to next semester. Director Call floated in his office long after most of the students had departed, reviewing the term's accumulated reports and beginning his preparations for the semester ahead. The Human Integration Initiative had, by any honest measure, succeeded well beyond his own most optimistic early projections. There had been challenges, certainly, and no shortage of genuine concern along the way. But on the whole, the experiment had demonstrated clearly that humans could thrive within a galactic educational environment. He pulled up the incoming application files for the following term. 4 additional human students were requesting admission to Halcyon Conservatory. He approved all 4 applications without hesitation, appended a note recommending an updated safety orientation protocol, and considered seriously whether the conservatory ought to bring on a counselor specifically trained in Death World species integration. He allowed himself, at the end of a long day, a small, genuine moment of quiet satisfaction. The galaxy was changing, expanding, growing steadily more diverse, more genuinely interesting. And if that meant occasionally watching a student tear a jammed door clean off its frame, or clear an entire gymnasium in a single leap, or casually mention, over lunch, a plant capable of killing a person, then that, he reflected, was simply the honest, ongoing cost of real progress. He filed his final report to the Coalition Education Board with a single concluding line. Recommend continued, and expanded, human integration across all coalition educational programs. They may come from a death world, but they are now unmistakably our death world students, and this conservatory is genuinely, measurably better for having welcomed them. Sadie boarded the transport that would carry her back to Earth, waving goodbye to the small cluster of friends who had come to see her off. As the ship eased away from the station, she watched through the viewport as Halcyon Conservatory grew steadily smaller behind her, a bright, glittering structure suspended against the vast, patient darkness of open space. She thought about how frightened she'd been on that very first day, walking into an unfamiliar school with no real idea what to expect. She thought about the visible fear in her new classmates' eyes, the confusion, the slow, careful shift from wariness into something like genuine friendship. She thought about the emergency, and the way something in her had simply, immediately known exactly what to do, had moved before conscious thought could even catch up, because that was simply what happened when people around you needed help. And she thought already about next semester, about returning to this place and these particular people, about continuing to close the strange, wide gap between death world human and civilized galaxy, one small friendship at a time. The galaxy, she was beginning to understand, was a vast, strange, genuinely wonderful place, full of beings who had evolved in circumstances so different from Earth's that they might as well have originated in separate universes. And yet somehow, despite all of that difference, common ground had still been found. People had learned, gradually and with real effort on both sides, to look past an intimidating exterior toward the actual person underneath. They had discovered together that genuine friendship remained entirely possible even between predator and prey, between death world survivor and pampered station dweller alike. She settled back into her seat, pulled out her data pad, and began writing, not a formal report of any kind, simply a private set of personal observations on her first semester among the stars. She wrote about her classes, her new friends, the misunderstandings, and the small, steady revelations. She wrote about what it had felt like to be constantly, acutely aware of her own difference, and how that difference had slowly, steadily become far less important than the genuine connections she'd built despite it. She closed with a single thought that made her smile as she wrote it down. Turns out being human is weird, no matter where in the galaxy you go. But weird, it turns out, is okay. Weird is interesting. Weird means you've got stories worth telling and a perspective worth sharing. I'm a death world predator dropped into a galaxy of careful, civilized prey species. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, that's exactly who I'm supposed to be. The transport jumped smoothly to faster-than-light travel, and the surrounding stars stretched gently into long, steady lines of light. Behind her, Halcyon Conservatory continued quietly about its business of educating the galaxy's youth. Ahead of her, Earth turned patiently in its familiar orbit, a small, blue world of terrifying biodiversity and genuinely stunning beauty in equal measure. And somewhere in between the two, one human girl smiled quietly to herself, already planning exactly what she'd tell her friends back home about her first semester of Death World exchange. The galaxy, she suspected, would never entirely know quite what to do with humans. They were too tough, too endlessly adaptable, too stubbornly optimistic in the face of genuine danger. They broke, cheerfully and repeatedly, every careful rule about how evolution was supposed to work, combining predatory physical capability with prey species' social instincts, blending individual physical toughness with a deep, practiced talent for collective cooperation. But perhaps, she thought, watching the stars streak steadily past her window, That particular kind of contradiction was exactly what the wider galaxy actually needed. Something that refused to fit neatly into any of its long-established categories. Something that could challenge careful old assumptions simply by walking into a classroom looking, for all the galaxy could initially tell, like an entirely ordinary schoolgirl, while quietly carrying, just beneath that ordinary surface, the considerable strength of a death world predator who had, somewhere along the way, simply decided that friendship mattered more than fear ever could.